Hey everyone, how's it going? During a very productive week, I painted 5 paintings for my India trip, all in 1 week, mostly thanks to coffee and basically not eating. So what I did was I woke up early and drank a coffee, and usually I would have breakfast and lunch and all that stuff. But this week I decided to try simply not eating anything until my work for the day was done. And it worked out great. I was able to get these 5 small paintings done very quickly, and this is the 3rd of them. The subject of this one is a man that I spotted in Varanasi. And what really got me interested in this guy is his yellow turban, but also his cheeks that are sunken in. My girlfriend suggested that it's probably because he's missing his teeth in the back of his jaw, so it causes his cheeks to be sunken in like that. It's a very interesting facial feature I haven't seen before. I found a lot of people in India had incredibly interesting to paint facial structures and characteristics. Very visible facial muscles and bones. It's a lot of fun, and possibly my favorite subject of all, so that's why I picked this guy to paint this time. I expected to have a pretty easy time with this one, as I did with the other 4 paintings, but for some reason this one was a little more challenging. I think if I had to guess why that happened is because he doesn't have light directly on his face. He's just catching a little bit of rim light. So the values all over his face are flat and indirect. So I have to build form in a more subtle way than if he had light hitting him directly. But he has some on the top of his turban, which really helps show the form. But when you don't have light hitting directly like that, the form can become kind of flat. And maybe I had a little bit of a struggle with that, so it took longer than I expected. Considering the type of character that this man's face has, I knew that I wanted this painting to be more on the gritty and wild side. So I was expecting to play with texture, brush strokes, load up on some thick paint, and be a little more loose and free than usual. I feel that sometimes your subject matter calls for a different approach that better emphasizes the model's qualities. If you have an elegant model, perhaps it would be nice to paint it in an elegant and simplified way. But if you have a character like this, why not emphasize it with some wild strokes and play of texture? Feel a little bit more free to play with the paint. So I'm starting to paint the earring here, and this is really fun painting metal. Usually the way I go about it is I paint it from the darks and I build up all the way towards the highlight, which is going to be the brightest note, and it's going to make the metal sing. When I put down the highlight on the metal like I'm doing now, I always try my best to make it a thick and very crisp brushstroke with hard edges. It really shows off the metal quality that way. The red paint that I'm putting on his forehead right now is more commonly known as tilak, and it can be made of various things from clay or red lead or some sort of paste. Usually the shape of it tells us something about the wearer and who he worships. I found resources for explaining vertical lines or triple red lines, but this man, he has this irregular stain that I couldn't find any information about, so I'm not sure what it denotes in this case. Something I really love about painting fabric is what I'm doing now, which is painting light passing through it. It creates these super saturated and bright shadows inside the fabric that I just love so much. If you use some foresight and planning, you can actually denote these areas with a thin stain rather than painting it. And what's good about the stain is that if you're staining the white canvas with the color, you're going to be able to get a very bright but colorful result, which is what these draperies that have light pass through them have. Whereas when you paint it in real paint like I did, there's a little bit of a challenge because you want it to be bright, but you also want it to be very saturated. And when you make things brighter, you sometimes add white, which kills the color. So maybe a clever way to do this would have been to use a stain, but that requires some foresight and planning ahead. I actually did that on my next painting in my India series, so you'll be able to see me do that in another video. Speaking of surfaces, I'm continuing this series on an Artifacts aluminum panel, and this one has a linen canvas on it, which comes with a very nice texture. I selected this panel for this painting specifically because I was anticipating the usage of the canvas texture to make the painting more gritty. And it came in very useful as I was painting this jacket. You'll see later on I scumble some paint and I utilize the texture of the canvas to a great effect. You can see me scumbling some lines into the jacket, which helps pick up the texture of the panel. So when you're anticipating a need for texture, you might want to pick out a canvas that's kind of fast drying. So when you put down some earth tones such as this early on in the painting, a couple hours later, you're going to be able to work on semi-dry paint and be able to pick up the texture of the canvas underneath. You can help that by not using any medium in your paint as well, so to make sure that the paint that's on your brush is pretty dry, and you can lightly drag it across the surface of the panel to pick up the texture. I heard that the Russian artist Fechin, who loved the use of texture in his paintings, he would actually squeeze out his paint on some towels, and the linseed oil would go into the towel, be absorbed into it, and what would remain is just the dry paint. It was very stringy and tough. So he used this paint in his painting to help with building texture. And he also painted on top of lead priming, which dried the paint out faster than usual. Now I'm going into the background and putting down some thick, bold brushstrokes with as much paint as possible in order to get some play of paint and some freedom happening in this painting. Looking back at the video, I realized that I did actually like the stained version of the background before I did all this as well. But the thick paint lets us have some fun and adds something fun to look at for the audience. This abstract approach is quite difficult for me because it's more esoteric, and you get better with it by experience rather than by learning a technique directly. When it comes to painting something not specific like a blurry background, this is where your personality can shine and the differences between artists emerge. Some people may paint the blurry photo effect, some people may paint specific details, some may use palette knife, others something else. And there's no right or wrong, this is where your personality comes to the surface. And that's it. Thank you guys for joining me today, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe because I got 2 more paintings left in this India series. Cheers.